All right, well, thanks very much for inviting me. It's great to be here. Great to be with a bunch of folks who share my enthusiasm for native wildlife and the outdoors. See some familiar faces in the audience, which is fun. This is going to be sort of a bits and pieces talk. I've got a mixture of sort of slides that I'll show, and I've got a couple of animals to show you too. The focus is, basically on sort of about reptiles and amphibians as sort of backyard wildlife. And as Eric said, I think our herpetofauna often gets overlooked in favor of flashier, more obvious creatures like birds and mammals and even pollinators and butterflies and things like that. But they're no less important. Sort of I've got three parts to the talk today. I'm going to start by sort of introducing reptile and amphibian biology, why they're interesting, why they're unusual, why we should care about them, why we should maybe work to encourage our backyards as reptile and amphibian biodiversity hotspots. Then I'll sort of introduce some of the local critters that you might see in your backyard, as well as some that are sort of interesting and unusual that we have around here. And then I'll finish with a few slides of what you can do within the context of your backyard wildlife plan, native plantings, et cetera, to particularly encourage these species to make your yard their home. All right, so as we said, I'm a herpetologist. That means I study reptiles and amphibians. So for those of us familiar with wildlife in general around here, this covers critters like frogs and toads, salamanders, and the amphibians. And the reptiles, we have things like turtles, lizards, snakes. But we should remember that worldwide, here we all recognize pretty easily our typical reptiles and amphibians, but this group contains some really weird and unusual species that we might not often think about. So some critters like these, we have things like the large aquatic salamanders. These are things that people call them Congo eels or mud eels. They look like an eel. They get 4 to 5 feet long, but they're a salamander, as closely related to these guys as anything else. We have a diverse group in the tropics called the Caecilians, which is a whole other totally different group of amphibians. If you caught one, you'd think it was a giant earthworm looking at it. They're segmented. Most of them are blind or eyeless. They're limbless, obviously. But when you look a little bit more closely, they're definitely amphibians. They're voracious little predators. They have a backbone. They have little teeth and a pretty formidable jaws, and they're hunting underground. Little invertebrates and things like that. Likewise, we have things like the rhynchocephalians, the worm lizards, which are these they're lizard relatives, but they look almost more like a Caecilian than anything else. They live underground. Most of them are limbless, but this one from Mexico has 2 little limbs. Anybody know what this critter is here? Nope, looks like an iguana. It's from New Zealand.
I am breathing.
It's a tuatara, yeah. So this is a unique animal called a tuatara. They're only found in New Zealand. Looks superficially like a lizard, but this is actually not a lizard at all. The lineage of these goes way back to before the dinosaurs. There was a time on Earth when these were the dominant land animals, and they're no more closely related to a lizard than a T-Rex is, or maybe even further back than that. But these are sort of the last remnant of a once much more diverse lineage. As we said, around here, these are the species we're interested in. If you look at sort of the evolutionary history of these animals, the amphibians and the reptiles are not particularly closely related to one another. They're actually 2 pretty disparate groups. Mammals are much more closely related to reptiles reptiles are more closely related to mammals than they are to amphibians. Likewise, crocodilians, which I don't have up here because we don't have them right here in Fayetteville, but our crocodilians are much more closely related to birds than they are to things like snakes and lizards. So why do we treat these animals together? Why am I a herpetologist that studies these 2 totally unrelated groups, essentially? Well, the answer to that is that they share one major aspect in common, which is that they are ectotherms, which in sort of common language, that means they're cold-blooded. We don't like really the term cold-blooded because it suggests it has sort of a negative connotation. And in fact, something like this skink here is not cold at all. Their preferred body temperature is 85, 90 degrees. And out in nature, they move around in the landscape to maintain that temperature quite accurately. So in the summertime, their body temperature is nearly as constant as ours. They're just using their behavior rather than their own metabolism to fuel that body temperature, to keep themselves the right temperature. Why should we care about reptiles and amphibians? Well, this is a group that's been largely ignored or overlooked or even sometimes maligned by the public, but there's a lot of reasons why we should like them, right? They're an often underappreciated but really diverse component of biodiversity. Here in Arkansas, we have something like 140 species of reptiles and amphibians in the state, many of which occur here in Northwest Arkansas. Many of them are quite beautiful and have really interesting and unusual biologies. That ectothermic, cold-blooded lifestyle allows them a lot of flexibility to do things that mammals and birds can't. Like they can live in places where they only get to eat a couple of times a year. So places like hot deserts or very dry glade environments where the conditions might only be appropriate for activity for a short period of the year, and they can do that and then go hide underground for the rest of the year and be just fine. Whereas something like a mammal or a bird would die of starvation in days. Many of them are of high conservation concern. I'll talk more about that in a minute, but many of them are declining, and so they're sort of particularly valuable that way. And we're starting to learn more and more about how important these animals are in our actual natural ecosystems. And I'll elaborate on that in a second. So worldwide, in terms of diversity, reptiles and amphibians, even if you exclude birds, which really should be reptiles, they're over half of our total biodiversity of tetrapods, right? So huge diversity, especially in the tropics, but I'll show you in a minute that amphibian diversity is also very high in temperate regions. Just here in Arkansas, we have over 30 species of salamanders alone. Most people don't realize, but we are living in essentially the worldwide hotspot of salamander diversity. We sort of take salamanders for granted here when we go out in the woods and flip over a log and there's a salamander, but most of the world, that doesn't happen. In fact, I always joke that when I have colleagues come visit from Australia, everybody assumes that they want to see our timber rattlesnakes and copperheads and dangerous wildlife. They want to see salamanders because they've never seen a salamander. There's no salamanders in Australia, most of Africa and South Asia, a lot of South America. By far, the highest diversity of salamanders is in the Appalachians and the higher elevation areas in the eastern temperate forests. So that includes the Ozark and Ouachita Mountains. So these are just a smattering of our local salamanders. We've got sort of two major groups represented here. These are what we call the pond breeding salamanders, or the embystomatiid salamanders. These are the ones that breed in wetlands, usually fishless ephemeral wetlands, still water, usually puddles or pools that fill up in the spring. They lay their eggs. Their larvae look like tadpoles, but they're little carnivores. They voraciously eat up things like mosquito larvae and stuff like that. And then after a couple of months, they metamorphose into these adults. The adults get quite large and impressive. We also have a suite of stream breeding species. So these are species that live in and around streams. We even have this particularly cool one here. This is called the Grotto Salamander. It's actually now been split, I think, into 3 different species based on genetics. But this is a crazy salamander. As a larva, it looks like a normal salamander larva. It lives in streams. You find them on the surface in rocky areas. But then when it undergoes metamorphosis, it goes underground and becomes this golem creature. That skin grows over their eyes. They become essentially blind. They lose all their pigments, and they're essentially never found on the surface after that. And really the only time we see these, you can see them in show caves. They're pretty common in some of the show caves, or when people are digging or drilling wells, sometimes they'll hit an aquifer and salamanders start popping out from 200 feet underground. Yeah, really, really crazy salamanders. We also have some bizarre ones. I mentioned some of these large swamp-dwelling salamanders, the Amphibians and the sirens. We also have this really charismatic critter here, the Hellbender, now split into 2 species or subspecies. But this is probably the 3rd largest salamander in the world. It has some cousins in East Asia that are a little bit bigger, but these get 3 feet long easily. Unfortunately, these are also some of our most imperiled salamanders. These live in large rivers, but they need very clean, cold water, well-oxygenated water, big flat rocks that they can hide under, and especially sedimentation, siltation, pollution are really hard on these guys. In fact, in Arkansas, they're pretty much restricted to the 11-point river system now. They used to be a little bit more widespread than that. They're also a little more widespread in Missouri, but the Ozark subspecies is, I think, federally threatened now, so they're not doing very well. We also have a whole slew of woodland salamanders, including some that have very restricted ranges. So these woodland salamanders don't breed in the water at all. They have what we call direct development, which means they lay their eggs in a moist place on land, and those hatch into tiny little salamanders. They don't have a larval stage at all. So they need moist conditions, but they don't need water to breed. And this allows them to colonize areas like very high elevation mountaintops. And what's happened in the evolutionary past, as the climate has become drier and wetter, and ice ages have come and gone, these have gotten stranded on mountaintops and speciated into different species. So this complex of species, basically there's a different species on each mountaintop in the Ouachitas. Some of these have just tiny little ranges that basically encompass one mountaintop. But these are different enough that you can even look at them morphologically, and they're very clearly different. You know, the Fuchs Mountain salamander here has big, largish spots. The Grotto Salamander has these little grassy spots. The Rich Mountain Salamander, which you found down by Mina, has this sort of beautiful chestnut color on the back. And all of these are just found, I mean, this is the entire range of the species. It's just one mountaintop in the Ouachitas. We also, talking about how secretive these animals are, we just got a totally new salamander about a little less than 10 years ago. This is from down in Hot Springs, and they were sampling these little stream salamanders, which normally exhibit metamorphosis, so they metamorphose into terrestrial adults, and they found these larval ones that clearly had eggs in them. So suggesting that they're what we call pedomorphic, which means they stay aquatic and mature in their larval form. They did the genetics, and it turns out this is a totally different salamander. It's not even very closely related to the ones that look kind of similar that live nearby. And this is found in one little stream system outside Hot Springs.
Did they protect it?
I believe the stream that they're known from is on a state park, which is good. They probably occur more widely on the timberlands down there, but that hasn't been fully explored yet. Our snakes are also very diverse and beautiful. These are just some of the most, these are actually all fairly common, but just beautiful snake species that we have around here in Northwest Arkansas. Speckled king snake, milk snake, ringneck snake, which you're probably familiar with. This is probably the most common snake we have around here. The green snake. They have really interesting behaviors as well. This is one you may be familiar with, the hognose snake. Prefers sort of dry, xeric forests. It's a specialist on amphibians, especially toads. So essentially all that these eat as adults are toads. They have specialized, they're not really fangs, they're just enlarged teeth in the rear of their mouth that they use to pop the toad, because the toads inflate their body as a defense, blow up like a balloon, and then they've got specialized teeth that pop them. It's kind of gross, but it's pretty cool. These are famous for their defensive behavior. So this is a harmless species. In fact, they really don't bite hardly ever, but they go through the most amazing series of dramatic show when they get scared. First, they spread their neck like a cobra. They do this sort of neck spreading, hooding behavior. They hiss loudly. They lunge at you with their mouth open. And then if you poke them enough, they eventually flip over and play dead. They hang their mouth open. They usually poop all over the place. And then when they're doing this, they are committed to it. You flip them over, and they just flip right back over again. It's actually really hard to take a picture of one normally, because they do this when you're trying to take a picture of them. This is one of my favorites, not found in Northwest Arkansas, but this is a delta species found in the eastern part of the state. It's called a mud snake. Beautiful species. They get pretty big, obviously. This is one of my students. They live in the swamps and muddy, mucky habitats, cypress swamps and other places like that. You hardly ever see them because they don't bask in the sun like a water snake does. They spend almost all their time down in the mud, and they're hunting these sirens and amphibians. Essentially, all they eat are these giant aquatic salamanders, sirens and amphibians. So if we have all this amazing and beautiful biodiversity of reptiles and amphibians, why aren't they a bigger deal? Why don't we think about them more, right? Well, the answer is that ectothermic lifestyle means that they can hide really well, and they can spend long periods of time out of the way where we're not looking for them, right? They're not flitting around foraging all the time like a bird might be. So maybe we'll have a little fun here and see just how good we are at spotting the secretive reptiles here. Anybody spot the snake here? Right here, right?
Yeah.
Everybody
Up
agree?
above it?
No?
Bottom.
Oh, bottom down here, okay. Everybody agree we got one here, one here?
Yeah.
Okay. Nobody sees this one up here? Or this one over here? So as best I can tell, there's at least 8 snakes in this picture. These are all cottonmouths. This was one, this was in South Carolina, but it was a beautiful spring morning. The sun had just come out, and these are emerging from a hibernaculum in this riprap here. But, you know, for every one you see, you're probably walking right by dozens of them.
Would you take the red off again so we can?
Yeah, so we got a pile of like 4 here, I think. 2 more alongside. There's one stretched out here, one there, one down here. I think that's most. There's probably more that I can't see in this picture. That day we counted easily 50 cottonmouths on about an hour hike that day. The crazy thing is, most of the year, if it wasn't that perfect day of spring emergence, you'd go out here and you might see one if you're lucky. So most of the year they're hiding. This is just the one day where they're out soaking up the sun, trying to warm up in the spring. This one, a little bit more, or more zoomed in at least. Can you see him? This is a speckled rattlesnake from the southwest.
Right in the middle.
Right through the middle. Big, fairly large snake, actually. The neat thing about these speckled rattlesnakes is they range throughout the whole sort of desert southwest, and they've evolved to match the colors of the rocks in the mountains they live in. So this is from some of the granite mountains right on the Arizona border. You go up near Phoenix where the rocks are sort of a pinkish granite. They're pinkish with big speckles. You go to Las Vegas where the rocks are red and they're like almost red in color. It's really pretty neat. Locally around here, we've had similar surprises where we think we know what species occur in an area, and then we find that we've missed one all along. This is actually a cave salamander that I caught in my backyard after living there for 5 years and documenting. I think I've got 14 or 15 reptile and amphibian species in my yard, just a couple blocks off Dixon and Fayetteville. And it turns out I've got cave salamanders too. I just didn't know it. And I happened to be out there taking out the compost one night, and this guy was walking right across my front steps, and I never would have known he was there. Mount Kessler in Fayetteville is a place that I love to take students. It's a great resource to have for teaching and stuff. We take classes out there all the time. We go look for animals out there all the time. Over 5 or 6 years, we had documented 35 reptile and amphibian species there, which is pretty high diversity for a spot like that. We thought we had them all, but we always wondered why we never had a milk snake, because that's one that should be there. The habitat looks right. And lo and behold, 6 years into it, we turn up this beautiful milk snake from Mount Kessler. So, you know, these are species that just because you haven't seen them, you can go years with experienced people looking for them, and that biodiversity is there, and it hasn't even been documented, which of course it makes it really challenging for conservation, because how do you protect things when you don't even know if they're there or not? As I said, reptiles and amphibians are some of our higher conservation concern species. Globally, amphibians are pretty well recognized as some of the fastest declining and most imperiled species. Something like over 50% now of the known amphibian species are threatened to some degree. That's more than all of the other major vertebrate groups. I think a slide that really drives home the sort of severity of amphibian declines. This is from my ecology textbook. So I teach a big general ecology class every fall. This was the edition of the textbook I started with in 2011, and they had a figure of amphibian decline. So these are amphibians that are extinct, critically endangered in red, or vulnerable, threatened in yellow. So when I started teaching at the UA, 2011 version of this book, there were like 23 imperiled and 2 extinct in North America. If you look at Central America, it's 3 and 13. The 4th edition of this book came out a couple of years ago, and it's now 107 and 41, 350 and 231 species of amphibians in the neotropics that are extinct, missing, or critically endangered. So that's how fast this is happening. We're lucky in the eastern US that our species, the vast majority of them, are more secure. A lot of these declines are happening associated with epidemic disease. There's a fungal disease that's really bad in the neotropics and in Australia and South Asia. So that's some examples of why we should care about reptiles and amphibians. One thing that's been a little slower to emerge, we now appreciate more their diversity and biology. but we're only just discovering their sort of roles as ecosystem components. How important are they? And unfortunately, in this area, we're fighting against this misconception that because we don't see them very often, they may not be all that important. And in fact, I love to show this slide. This was my first introduction to reptiles and amphibians when I was a kid, the golden guide, right? I was flipping through this. This was now probably 10 years ago, but as an adult, as a now probably a graduate student at that time, I found this in my room at my parents' house. I was flipping through it, and it has this really cool little paragraph here on the value of reptiles that concludes, as a group, they are neither good nor bad, but are interesting and unusual, although of minor importance. If they should all disappear, it would not make much difference. Yeah, so this is the historical attitude that we're fighting for with these animals, because historically, they just weren't considered valuable as wildlife. Turns out they can be. This little gecko in the Caribbean is thought to be the world's densest terrestrial vertebrate. Densities have been estimated at 25,000 per acre. So, I mean, that's literally tens of animals per square meter sometimes. I had a little experience with this massive biomass. This was a project we did when I was a grad student in South Carolina, where we had an amphibian breeding wetland, and we completely encircled it with this device that we call a drift fence, which basically is a way to capture animals as they come and go. We make a fence, and we have little traps or buckets along the fence that the animals fall into as they come and go from the wetland. We ran this fence every day, multiple times a day for a year, and over a year we caught nearly 500,000 amphibians coming and going from this wetland. Totaled over 3,000 pounds of frogs and toads coming and going from this wetland. So this kind of biomass, I mean, this is massive amounts of food for predators. These are animals that are eating insects and stuff like that. So clearly, just the biomass angle makes them important. Here in the eastern U.S., there's some great studies on small woodland salamanders. Again, we sort of take these guys for granted. Our local species that is this equivalent is the zigzag salamander, the Ozark zigzag salamander. These are common under logs and stuff in the woods, but the total abundance of these animals can be huge. In fact, in New Hampshire forests, they estimated the biomass of these, and it's thought to be 5 times as high as the biomass of breeding birds in that system. Places in the Appalachians, salamander densities can be 10 times that high. Yeah?
Why is biomass so important? You mentioned it on the last slide as well.
Well, so that's indicative of energy that's available for higher predators essentially to eat, as well as that abundance, that biomass of salamanders. Those are all consuming little insects all the time. And in fact, I didn't get too heavy into the science here, but there have been some cool papers that have looked at salamanders in terms of the effect they have on leaf litter systems. They do things like slow the rate of decay of leaf litter because they eat a lot of the little decomposing insects. That paper went on to suggest that salamanders alone could solve global warming by causing carbon sequestration. They went a little far with their conclusions, I think, but the numbers are big is the point there. Locally here, if we're thinking about sort of backyard species, these are some of our major predators. Even if we don't see them all the time, we have things like our lizards and small amphibians that are eating invertebrates. We have things like some of our small snakes that are eating things like slugs and snails and earthworms. We have things like rat snakes, which are major predators on small rodents, things like squirrels and rats and small rabbits and things like that. In fact, in urbanized areas where some of the larger predators like bobcats and mountain lions and things like that are gone, these may be some of the more important predators on our sort of larger mammals that tend to sort of overpopulate in urban areas. Okay, so that's my little spiel about why we should care about reptiles and amphibians. Let's meet a couple, okay? So I'll pull out a few here that might be particularly interesting.
What's the reason for the decline, the big decline? Could it be, is insect population decline part of it as well?
It's thought to be. There have been some papers that have come out recently that suggest that insects are in just massive decline. And so some species like the green snakes are ones that seem to be less common than they used to be. They don't seem to be directly affected by any kind of disease or anything. So Maybe it's loss of their prey, perhaps. Could also be things like pesticides in more agricultural landscapes.
Green snakes are insectivores, right?
They are. And they're eating like hard-bodied arthropods, which most other snakes are not.
Oh, how
And
cute.
so when people are spraying for those things, it's less of those.
You'd think, or it might directly poison them even. Yeah, same things as birds. So here's one of our local frogs, kind of a neat one. This is a green tree frog. We have 2 local tree frogs here. This is actually the less common one, and these are actually expanding from the river valley up here in northwest Arkansas. We also have one called a gray tree frog, which sort of has a tree bark pattern, gray or green.
Was that a highlight?
It's a hyla. Yep, this is hyla cinerea. Pretty neat little guys. These guys have suction cup feet, so they have suctions that work by, like wet suction, like a suction cup. When you see things like lizards, like geckos, that can also run up walls, that's actually not wet suction. It's static electricity, essentially, that's keeping them up there.
What's his name?
I don't think he has a name. The students might have named him.
I can name him.
Would that be a food source for a Hognose snake?
Hognose snakes are eating more toads. I think they would eat a tree frog, but these are up in the trees much more. Everything eats frogs. Frogs are great food for a lot of birds. A lot of our raptors and birds of prey love to eat frogs. Snakes like to eat frogs, raccoons and foxes and stuff like that. In fact, some of our birds of prey, red-shouldered hawks, snakes are one of their favorite foods. Barred owls eat lots of amphibians and semi-aquatic species. So this is kind of a neat one. The best way to see tree frogs, at least to see them, is to go look around your lights at night. They learn pretty quickly to come catch insects around lights on your porch. And you'll actually hear them calling starting in maybe a few weeks or so. These have kind of a honking call. The one that you hear more often is the gray tree frog, which has a sort of trill, like a hear that summer night kind of sound. Those are gray tree frogs. These tree frogs can do amazingly well in urban areas. I find them on campus in Fayetteville quite a bit. In fact, when we do experiments with what we call mesocosms, which are essentially cattle tanks or kiddie pools made to be little ponds. We have big problems with these coming in and messing up our experiments by laying eggs in our study system.
Does he have a name?
He doesn't have a name. I think the students might name him.
So
I'll name him.
So are amphibians more susceptible to, like, when people are using like either herbicides, pesticides, do they absorb that through their skin, or insecticides, or is there any sort of issue?
Yeah, amphibians are thought to be, there's some debate about that, but they're thought to be more sensitive than a lot of other wildlife to toxicants in the environment. Also things like turbidity and low oxygen in aquatic environments. Some of the stream salamanders that I mentioned, like the cave salamander, are particularly sensitive because that whole group of salamanders they're called the lungless salamanders, the plethodonid salamanders, and they lack, so the adults lack lungs. Once they metamorphose, they don't have gills either. They breathe completely through their skin. So they don't breathe in and out at all. They just absorb oxygen through their skin. So that requires them to have very porous skin and presumably makes them quite sensitive to degradation of aquatic habitat. Yeah.
Do you have a feel for the water quality in streams and creeks in northwest Arkansas and Ozarks in general?
Not specifically. I will say that we do find, we still find these salamanders quite a bit, maybe not in the most urbanized streams, but once you get out of like the all impervious areas, we tend to see them even in the sort of residential streams and stuff. So probably reasonably high, but I don't have those numbers for you. So this is a salamander. This is one of those pond breeding ambistomatid salamanders I mentioned before. These are really neat. This is called a spotted salamander, believe it or not. We have another one which was on my slide before called the ringed salamander, which is kind of special because it's an Ozark watchtower endemic. It's only
Does
found
he
in
have a name?
that region. I don't think this guy has a name. Some of the snakes have names.
I can name him.
So these guys, they spend 95% of their adult life in burrows or underground, often well away from the wetlands they breed. And then on the right night in the spring, usually the first big rain in early March or late February, These come out at night and march through the woods down to their ponds, and they all breed at once. And it's a pretty fantastic experience to see if you've ever been out there. I always take students out, and after going months and months without seeing one of these, even after flipping over lots of rocks and logs, you can go to one of these wetlands, and there'll be hundreds or thousands of them all. The males do little dances, and the females lay egg masses, and they're really neat. Unfortunately, these are still relatively common, which is good, but they're threatened by a variety of issues because they move long distances between the woods and the wetlands. They're sensitive to things like road mortality. A lot of them get run over crossing roads. Also, degradation of the wetlands that they breed in is an important problem for them because, as I said, the wetlands where these breed, probably not so much the folks in this room, but many folks, when you talk about them breeding in a pond, they're thinking of like Beaver Lake or Lake Fayetteville or a farm pond where you have bass and fish for dinner or whatever. Those are not suitable habitats for these. These need fishless, usually small, usually ephemeral, meaning that they dry up at some point, wetlands. So the best wetlands for these are ones that hold water from about February through June or July, and then dry up in the summer. That would kill off any fish that got in there. It would, it allows the plant life to grow up afterwards, and you get a much more productive environment. So unfortunately, when we come in and we have a ditch or a wet spot, very often we either fill it in because it breeds mosquitoes, or we dig it out so it holds water and put bass in there so we can fish for dinner.
So it needs shallower water, or does it do well in deeper water?
The depth isn't so important as much as the hydro period, how long it holds water. So for these need a little bit longer hydro period, several months, at least 3-4 months. Some of the frogs can go very quickly. So toads could go, they can go from tadpole to metamorphosis in a month. So even a tire rent can be a breeding site for things like toads.
So in general, go ahead.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, does that size max out either? I mean, so tire size to this room, or are you talking much larger than that?
So the size will determine how big the total population that can be supported is. In fact, most of the data suggests that the size of that breeding wetland is the biggest thing determining the local population size. And I mean, if they don't have fish, wetlands can be big. That wetland that I mentioned before where we had 500,000 of these, that was like a 5-acre wetland, but it dries out every once in a while and it's not connected by a stream or a river. So there's no fish in there. And I mean, I have no idea how many salamander larvae that are in there. I mean, it must be millions because every one of these, so when a female comes down to lay eggs, she's going to lay 200 or 300 eggs in a season.
I think those I've found underneath my wood pile, like when I'm moving logs, I'll lift one up that's on the ground and it'll be under there, but I think I'm only close to like an intermittent stream.
Well, so they'll go a kilometer or more to their breeding site. So
Gotcha.
The adults will be nowhere near water. And some of the frogs go even further. We've got one called the Crawfish Frog, which is a prairie frog that unfortunately has declined a lot, but still persists in some of our prairie remnants. They'll go 1.5 kilometers or more away from their breeding sites. Yeah, they travel long. And of course, that's the problem because the place you see them is the wetland. So you can protect the wetlands.
Right.
But if you bulldoze, and it's a huge footprint, we're talking, if it's 1.5 kilometers, that's like, probably a couple hundred acres where the adults are living outside the breeding season.
Kilometer radius of a giant circle.
How what?
A large one.
This is an average size adult. They can be a little longer than this, but this is sort of typical size. And these are some of our larger salamanders. Most of our salamanders are quite small.
Is it Investment maculatum?
This is maculatum, yeah.
Because I have seen them a foot long.
Really?
In
That'd be really big.
In the breeding pond. They look pretty impressive.
Yeah, they do get bigger than this.
But
A foot
maybe
long
they're
would be
rare
big.
now. Maybe
I
nobody
can name him.
Maybe.
I can name him.
How long would you say, like 8? Can they get up to 8 inches or?
Yeah, 8, maybe 10 inches, pushing it.
I mean, yeah, it's about a
We
foot.
should invite them out there. This is
Yeah,
the
we'd
time
love
of
to come
year
see 'em.
them.
Yeah, in fact, they're done breeding now. The larvae will be in there now.
He's out there, the giant.
So let's see a couple of reptiles. How about we start with these? Just to show you guys are probably familiar with these if you spent much time outside, but a couple of the skinks. I brought these just because these are some of the most common little backyard critters. These are two of our common skinks. The small one is the brown skink, and that's an adult. You don't get much bigger than that. The striped one is called a five-line skink. People call them blue-tailed skinks. They have blue tails when they're little, but when they mature, they turn sort of uniform brown.
What's the point of the blue tails? To have a purpose, I'm assuming.
That's debatable. Some argue that it's just to distract the predator. So lizards in general will drop their tail as a defense. The tail keeps wiggling, and the idea is the predator goes after the tail while the lizard escapes. It works. It's amazing how often we find a snake that's got a whole bunch of lizard tails in its stomach and no lizard. Some apparently, so we have the five-line skink is the common skink here. Throughout the southeast, there's a bunch of species that are blue-tailed as young. There's some suggestion that some of those are actually poisonous or toxic to predators, and that blue tail might be a mimicry situation. People's cats and dogs have gotten sick eating, not the ones that we have locally, but the ones in like Florida and Georgia and places like that. So there's debate about the function of those. These are great little critters. If you have, leaf litter and rocks in your backyard, patchy sunlight, these will certainly be there, and they're fun. It's great to watch them run around. They eat lots of little insects, ants, flies, bugs, things like that.
Are those the ones that if the tail gets bitten off, it grows back?
It does. Almost all of our lizards, at least our local lizards, have the ability to regrow their tails. So they'll drop it off as a defense, and then it'll regrow again. We actually caught one the other day that must have had a partially broken tail because it grew back forks, which was kind of cool.
Repeat your question.
I was just saying, how long does it take them to regrow? I mean, I assume it's species dependent. But
Yeah, and it's context dependent. It depends on how much food they're getting and things like that. What we have here.
So ephemeral habitats, whether they be ephemeral streams, wetlands, those are, I'm assuming, pretty important for, is it reptiles as well, or just amphibians?
Especially amphibians. I mean, there's a slew of semi-aquatic reptiles too. They're not as dependent on ephemeral conditions, other than those tend to be productive and have amphibians for them to eat and stuff like that. I can mention some characteristics. I've got a slide on wetlands in a minute.
I was gonna say, like out in the Southwest, a lot of stuff out there is very ephemeral, is my understanding. So whatever the water regulations on what's jurisdictional or not, they started eliminating all ephemeral waters. I imagine that would have a significant impact on amphibian populations.
Definitely,
Okay.
yeah, and that's been a struggle all along, whether or not these ephemeral habitats count as wetlands or not, has been.
If you think about
The
the way that
regulatory
people
decisions,
interact
exactly.
and preserve the biological, ecological, and it mentions the biological, ecological integrity of the waters in the United States. And so to me,
That should cover those things, but it gets tough practically too, because literally when a tire rut can be a breeding site,
yeah.
it gets tough to protect things like that.
Right.
But certainly the larger, and historically, these ephemeral wetlands have not received adequate protection. That's changing, it's gotten better, but.
Yeah. It might just be up in some areas to the states to have their own set of protections.
How about this?
Wow.
Anybody know what this is?
It used
I know
to
probably
have
one
snakes.
person at least knows what this is. I know what this guy is.
It's not a snake.
I want to
Yeah, we
call
got
it
more knowledgeable audience.
the glass lizard.
This is not a snake. This is a legless lizard.
Oh my God.
So this is our local species, the legless lizard or glass lizard. They're uncommon, and even where they occur, they're one of those ones that sometimes we've got a couple of sites where we did surveys there for years before finding one of these. They're underground most of the time. They're hidden most of the time. How can I tell if this is a lizard and not a snake?
That's what I'm wondering. Like, what's the difference?
What's
I
the
mean, I'm
difference?
sure there's a difference in the family tree of life.
There is actually, technically, snakes are just another lizard without legs, but we'll put that aside.
Okay.
Isn't the head maybe shaped a little bit different?
The head is shaped a little bit differently. They have different head, bone structure and stuff. And if you look at it, it looks like a lizard head. But there's a couple of sort of very key characteristics about the head. He's got eyelids. So if you stare at him long enough, he'll blink at you. Most of our lizards have eyelids. No snakes have eyelids. They have a clear scale that goes over their eye and protects it. He also, it's kind of hard to see in the patterning, but he's got a hole in the side of his head on each side. Those are his ears. So these have external ear openings. They're very much like a bird. You pull away a bird's feathers, it's got like a hole in the side of his head. It's his ears. And they hear very much like we do. So he's listening to me talking right now. Snakes don't hear in the same way that we do. They can feel vibration very well, but they don't pick up aerial vibration nearly like we do. And they don't have any kind of external ear opening or eardrum type mechanism.
Are their tongues different at all?
Their tongues are a little different. They function similarly. These guys have sort of a fatter, shorter tongue instead of a long, skinny tongue like a snake.
Do lizards like taste the air like some snakes do?
They do a little bit, not nearly like snakes do, but it varies a lot among lizards. These don't particularly. Some things like the monitor lizards do a lot of, and Gila monsters and things like that. You can also see he's a little bit stumpy. So he's also, that you see that point, he's starting to regrow his tail. So like other lizards, in fact, his tail is really long. It starts here. It's about half his body, and if he was complete, his tail would be another 6 inches longer. So like most of our other lizards, he's able to break and regrow his tail. That's one reason they're called glass lizards sometimes, is when you grab one in the field, this one's calmed down because we've had them for several years, but when you grab one in the field, they thrash like crazy, and they often just shatter into pieces.
Oh, wow.
Literally, the tail will break into multiple pieces, and they're all wiggling all over the place. It's very sort of somewhat mortifying when it happens in the field. But that's part of their natural defensive display, and he'll grow that tail back. Snakes can lose their tail. They don't detach it sort of voluntarily, but certainly they can have their tail chewed off or bitten off. It never regrows. They're stumpy for the rest of their life.
Do they have any, like, what do you call them, vestigial appendages or whatever left over from?
Nope, they don't.
evolutionary
Nope,
process?
not even internally. Whereas even some of the snakes, like some of the boas and pythons, have little vestigial claws that are what's left of their limbs. They even have little limb bones internally. Kind of crazy.
Interesting.
All right, let's see some real snakes. Couple of real
Bring a
snakes.
temple rattler with you.
Uh-oh.
I had to bring this one just because
It's not a snake.
this is one that if you spend any time in the woods and flip a few rocks, you'll see one of these. This is a ringneck snake. Very common woodland snake.
Woodland snakes.
Yeah. Beautiful little guy. They've got this beautiful pattern underside. These guys eat basically soft-bodied prey, so they'll eat worms, they'll eat salamanders, they'll eat slugs. That's mostly here. It's mostly worms. In parts of the east, they eat many more salamanders. They'll eat small frogs. This is a really big one. They don't get any bigger than this.
How much do you think that snake is?
There's no telling if this. This is a full-grown adult. This is even a large adult. And actually, so one of the sort of founding fathers of herpetology, Henry Fitch, was in Kansas, and he's like one of the godfathers of herpetology. He did some amazing long-term studies on these, years and years and years. He had some of these that lived in the field for 25 to 30 years. Yeah, so that's one thing, that low energy ectothermic lifestyle, not only do they not need to eat much, but they live a long time. A lot of these amphibians, these salamanders, can easily live 20 to 30 years, no problem.
And I see those around cinder blocks. Is there anything particular, or is that just?
They just like rock cover. Yeah, they like warm rock cover. So anywhere, they're usually forest associated. In fact, we don't see them in the historic prairies, even though they're very common in the forests. But anywhere with forests, and especially with rock, especially this time of year, they sort of come up under the rocks to thermoregulate. And I mean, we'll take a herp class out in the spring and catch 50
We
minutes.
used to have a snake named Cornelius.
You did. I had a corn snake named Cornelius for a while.
It might have been your old corn snake. It was an ONSC.
Oh, yeah?
And
He was an old
yeah, he-
corn snake.
Huh.
And he lived to be like, we don't know, but he lived to be like 26, 27 years.
That's pretty old, but I'm
He
not
retired.
terribly
Yeah.
surprised.
He was a snake ambassador for many years out the Ozark Natural Science Center. And,
So here's another very common backyard snake. This is the garter snake. So there's another one called a ribbon snake, which is closely related and very similar. They don't always have this brilliant red stripe. In fact, this is one from one of our local prairie sites. And this actually looks more like a garter snake we catch in Kansas, which is sort of an artifact of that prairie history. In fact, some of our other snakes, like racers in the prairies here, look yellow, like the racers in Kansas and Oklahoma do. This guy, so good example here. So this is a wild snake. So he's afraid of me. You can see one thing he's doing is flattening his body and spreading his body, and he's not doing it so much anymore. But this is one reason why I really don't like the triangular head thing for venomous snakes.
It's all round.
Our venomous snakes do have large triangular heads, but many of our non-venomous snakes will also, they either have triangular shaped heads or they'll even spread out their head and flatten out to look scary. And trying to convince someone that that's not a copperhead is sometimes difficult. Very common backyard snake. They're usually somewhere near water. They eat mostly worms and amphibians, so they're usually near moisture somewhere, often in sort of open grassy habitats. Yeah.
I saw a ring snake this past weekend that was laying on its back. I thought it was a ring snake, but maybe it was that other one you're talking about earlier.
I mean, it probably was, but why was it laying on its back? Do you know? Was it dead?
No, it was alive. It was just laying in the sun.
Usually they wouldn't lie upside down unless they've been like disturbed or scared, or there's some idea that bright coloration on their underside might be like a predator sort of shock value thing or something. But that's odd. I don't know why that would be the case. But
I've heard that ringneck snakes are actually venomous, but that their fangs are so far back in their mouth they can't bite.
They are, yeah. We often talk about venomous, non-venomous as like this dichotomy, and it's true that the ones that are medically significant in the U.S. are clearly in the viper and the coral snake groups, but many of our non-venomous snakes also have varying degrees of toxicity in their saliva or actual true venom secretions. Many are what we would call rear fang, which means they have sort of enlarged teeth in the back. They're not true fangs, but those ringneck snakes, yeah, I've seen one bite one of those little skinks and kill it in seconds. But they're not medically significant to people, and they don't typically bite anyway.
Pretty safe to handle.
Very safe to handle, yeah. There's never been any complication with handling. Yeah.
Speaking of handling, I'm curious, you're obviously very practiced at handling them. Do you notice a significant behavioral difference in the snake response to someone who is, sort of a energy dialogue, you might say? Like, I know John Young writes about this, about birds, and he has an honoring routine about, where he's not imposing on their habitat, he's giving them time to respond as a sort of very much an interaction and a dialogue with respect. But do you notice that between you as an expert snake or lizard handler and somebody who's just sort of haphazard going forward or doesn't have the same sort of, even though maybe somebody who's very knowledgeable but doesn't have seemingly an underlying respect for the animal?
Yeah, I mean, so all of our snakes, even our venomous snakes, they bite out of fear, right? They're not out to get us. They very well know that we're not a prey item that they can eat. They're striking out of defense when they're scared. So if you behave in a way that doesn't scare them, then they're often very calm. There's also a lot of personality differences, one snake to another. So as nice as I can be, I do get the odd water snake that just mauls me horribly. But many snakes, especially, if you imagine, most people when they pick up a snake, they come down from the top and they grab it. And they often grab it behind the head so they can't bite them. They think they're being grabbed by a hawk or a predator, essentially, right? So they do everything they can to retaliate or try to get out. Even a water snake, which has a reputation as being kind of a very defensive snake, often if you approach them quietly, calmly, on their level, pick them up gently, they often won't bite at all. They don't even necessarily get defensive.
Are you talking about water moccasins?
No, I'm talking about non-venomous water snakes, which actually I could, we'll grab the water snake.
So how do you pick up a snake?
Very careful.
How do I pick up a snake? It depends on the kind of snake and the circumstances, but
By the tail or?
I will usually pick them up with one hand by the rear of the body and then support them with the front of the body. They don't love to be like dangled by the tail, particularly. And you'll see like the people who I don't handle as a herpetologist. I don't have any desire to be bitten by a venomous snake. And the stuff you see on TV is stupid and dangerous. I never pin things behind the head. Whenever we catch venomous snakes, it's always tongs or a hook into a bucket or a bag.
I've seen people post pictures in the snake groups on Facebook, and the way they're holding it, people comment, and it's actually hurtful to the snake to let it hang like that.
It can be a really heavy snake. You can, especially some of our pit vipers that are very heavy bodied, they're heavy enough that you can actually, I've never seen evidence of like massive damage done that way, but it can't be great for them.
Gotcha.
So yeah, while we're talking about these snakes, so Here's a non-venomous water snake. This is our northern water snake, which is one of several non-venomous water snake species we have here. This is the one that's most common in more permanent water habitats, so larger streams, rivers, lakes. Every lake, pond, river, and stream in the eastern U.S. has some of these in it.
What's the name of that snake?
The northern water snake, or midland water snake, or banded water snake.
They eat fish, right? Or I've seen them with like a fish.
Yeah, they eat fish, so they're more fish eaters. They'll eat a variety of things, mostly aquatic prey, so mostly fish and amphibians. These tend to eat more fish, and so they're in more fishy habitats. We have another one called a yellow-bellied water snake that has a bright yellow underside. And those tend to be more amphibian specialists, so those tend to live more in the ephemeral wetland and marsh kind of habitats.
So is there a difference, like some people say there is and some people say there isn't, between a water moccasin and a water snake as far as whether they'll swim at the bottom of the creek versus on top of water, or?
Yes, there generally is, but it's not 100% fail. So generally, water snakes they don't typically float on the water. They can swim on the surface, but it'll be like just their head up and then their body sort of submerged.
Okay.
Water cottonmouths or water moccasins are very heavy bodied and they're very buoyant. So often when they swim, their body is literally sort of floating on the surface.
Okay.
But they can dive underwater just fine. They eat fish, so they can bite underwater. There's also a rumor that they don't bite underwater. You can't eat fish very well without biting underwater. So cottonmouths are actually, of our local venomous snakes, they're the hardest one to give people an easy identification trick, because they are very variable in color. They can be anything from almost black to quite strongly patterned. They're usually kind of broadly banded, but they don't have this sort of checkerboardy pattern like this guy has. And likewise, I'll show you a picture of a copperhead in a minute. Copperheads have
They have like the Hershey Kiss shape.
Yeah, they have the Hershey Kiss shape. What did I do with my pointer? There.
Is that a typical size for the water snake?
Yeah, this is an average adult size. They can get a bit bigger than this, and obviously they start smaller.
Oh, that is, it says a copperhead, I see.
Yeah. So copperheads have this hourglass shape or Hershey Kiss shape pattern, whereas this guy, further down they have sort of an alternating checkered pattern, and where the bands do fully encircle the body, it's wider on the top rather than narrower on the top.
So what about, can't water moccasins have some bands?
They can. So they don't have quite as easy like a copperhead has a very distinctive pattern. Cottonmouths have a pretty variable pattern. They do have large, blocky, triangular heads. If you look at enough pictures, you can spot the head on a cottonmouth easily.
Gotcha.
But simply saying triangular head means cottonmouth is very misleading. This guy, for a water snake, this guy is very well behaved. We've had him since he was a baby. But a wild water snake, they'll spread out their head to be almost arrow-shaped.
Wow. Is that a mimic thing to look like a copperhead?
Presumably, yeah, or just to look dangerous in general.
And they're pretty spastic, a wild one.
Yes, grabbing these in the wild is fun.
They got some pictures of one lunging at you and you're just talking.
Yeah, they do that.
I think Alyssa had a question.
Yeah.
So, is it true that I'm talking about cottonmouths are usually down lower in the creek bottoms than in the valleys, and not up on top of the mountains, or is that wrong?
Yeah, so cottonmouths are semi-aquatic,
Yeah.
so they spend some of their life in and around the water. Can you find them away from water? Absolutely. But there's usually water somewhere nearby, and they're most common around here along the larger creeks and rivers.
Yeah.
They tend to be nocturnal, so you don't see them as much, but it's actually kind of crazy how many cottonmouths there are along places like the Buffalo and the Kings River and places like that. It's actually surprising bites happen as infrequently as they do, because there's a lot of them out there.
But you could see them in a pond at the top of the mountain.
Yeah, you could. Around here, I'd say it would be unusual to have cottonmouths in a mountaintop pond. I'd much more expect to see water snakes.
Yeah, okay.
One interesting thing about this whole group of snakes that includes the water snakes as well as the garter snake that I just had, these are all live-bearing snakes, so they give birth to live young in the late summer or fall. They don't lay eggs like most snakes do. Our pit vipers do that too, so the cottonmouths and copperheads and rattlesnakes do as well. So unfortunately, these are really common in every kind of aquatic habitat. Most people see this and they think it's one of the two venomous snakes, and unfortunately these get killed all the time. They're definitely important components of our aquatic systems. These are important predators on frogs and small fish. They don't really eat game fish very much. People worry when they see these that they're eating all their bass. These are not after big bass very often. They're eating minnows and dead and dying things and stuff like that. These are also favorite prey of a lot of our birds of prey. Even herons and egrets and things will eat these as well.
Will they eat daily?
They will if it's available. Yeah, so that's, everybody focuses on the ability of snakes to go long periods without eating, and they certainly can. Some of these snakes, could easily go a year plus without eating anything, and they would be fine. But I think it's really their flexibility that's most amazing. Because on the one hand, when prey is scarce, they can go a year without eating, but when prey is abundant, they can grow really fast, reproduce really quickly. So basically they can take advantage of these sort of pulses of resources. There's some really cool examples of some islands way out in the Pacific that have large populations of particular snake species, and they basically persist by eating migratory birds that come through literally twice a year. They feed for like 2 weeks and they just gorge themselves on migratory birds. Then the birds move on, and the island is essentially, can't support any other species because there's nothing for them to eat outside of that season.
What if it gets mutated into a fire-breathing chicken?
I don't know about that. So this is probably my favorite local snake. I think maybe the most beautiful snake, one that's familiar to a lot of us. Speckled king snake. Ooh, he just snapped at me. He smells that water snake on my hand.
Oh, that's
Yeah. Usually this is one of the ones that we let little kids hold and stuff. He's hungry and he's smelling that. So this is a king snake, speckled king snake, one of a couple of different king snake species we have here. This is the one they're called a king snake because they eat other snakes. So these are really powerful constrictors. That water snake, it's not venomous. It's also not a constrictor. It just grabs a frog and eats it alive and swallows it alive. These are powerful constrictors. They eat all kinds of things, but they love to eat other snakes. This guy could eat that water snake, no problem. He would swallow him down, no problem.
They eat venomous snakes, right?
They do. They're mostly immune to the venom of our venomous snakes. And so this guy would take out a copperhead or a small rattlesnake, no problem. So this is one, they're very common throughout Northwest Arkansas, even in the more urbanized areas of Fayetteville. We're actually lucky to have these. They've sort of mysteriously disappeared from some areas in the Southeast where they used to be very common. I think the leading suspicion is that fire ants may be what did it, because the spatial and timing of when they disappeared pretty much matches up with when fire ants came in. So we're lucky to still have these. These are still very common in a lot of areas, and they're just beautiful snakes. This complex, so these are found, this species is found from New Jersey to Florida to California and to Mexico. They vary in pattern in a bunch of different ways throughout their range. Some of those pattern variants are very common pet captive snakes, so you'll see like California king snakes in the pet store. Same species as this, just a slightly different color pattern.
I've read when they're juveniles, they'll shake their tail in the leaf litter, kind of mimic a rattle.
They will. A lot of our, not just juveniles, a lot of our non-venomous snakes will do that. Okay. Yeah, so that's a defense that tricks a lot of people. So if he's down in the leaves and he's scared, he'll vibrate his tail really quickly, and it can sound convincingly like a rattlesnake in like deep leaf litter.
Interesting. If they ate a snake, they would have to be pretty lethargic for a while, wouldn't they?
Yeah, they digest it pretty quickly. I mean, a snake has to digest its food. The food's no different than anything else. So it's got to digest it within about a week and a half, 2 weeks, or it's going to rot in its stomach. So when they eat a big meal, I've caught king snakes with snakes longer than they are in their stomach. They have a way of like sort of kinking them up and bending them around so they fit in their stomach. And he'll go sit in the sun and heat himself up as much as possible, and he can digest that thing completely in about a week and a half. Snakes have extremely powerful digestive systems. So I work a little bit with Burmese pythons in Florida, the invasive pythons, and we have some of these pythons will eat a 80-pound deer and digest that thing. All that comes out are like a few little hoof fragments. They digest the bones, all the connective tissue, some hair, and hoofs is about all that comes out the other end. It's pretty impressive. All right, we'll do one more, and then I'll finish up the talking part. All right, let's look at, this is the largest common local snake you're likely to see, but also one that's very common in residential areas, especially like country barns and garages. Yep. Yeah, so this is a rat snake. They're often called black snakes, although that often applies to a couple of different species that are fairly large and black. This is the black rat snake or Texas rat snake. Beautiful big snake. This is a good sized one, but not a monstrous one. They'll get 7 to 8 feet long.
They love chicken eggs.
They love chicken eggs. If you want to see these, the best thing to do is put in a chicken coop. It's like a magnet to them.
Was its ancestors rats?
No, it eats rats. That's why it's called a rat snake. Yeah, so these, they eat mostly mammals and birds. In fact, they love to eat bird eggs, and throughout most of the eastern U.S., we're now learning that these are actually the major predator on bird nests, which, you know, some people don't love that. They do things like put netting around birdhouses and stuff, which is not great for the snakes. You know, I would argue that's a completely natural process. These are natural predators that are supposed to be there. But in most areas of the eastern U.S., these are like the primary bird predator. I have a colleague who studied these and their predation on birds, and they do some really interesting things. It's very clear they have very keen perception and hunting behavior. So he's documented on video. These snakes will come in and they'll find a nest, and you'll see the snake peek in when the nestlings are just like this big, and the snake will leave and come back. Almost always they come like the day before they fled.
Wow.
As big as possible. Raid the nest and
My grandmother used to have these purple bark houses way up high, and every once in a while there'd be a rat snake up in there.
Yeah, so these are great climbers in nature. They spend most of their time in the trees in the summer. They have this, we say they're sort of loaf of bread shape. They have a flat underside, and that the edge of that flat underside, basically you combine that with these, they've got these big ventral scales that face backwards. So this way it's nice and smooth. This way it catches, right? And so that edge, basically they can use the edges of those scales almost like little claws. And of course, each of these ventral scales is connected to a pair of ribs. So for each scale, he's got a pair of ribs and can actually move those ribs independently. So it's almost like he's a giant centipede. And it's amazing if you ever watch one of these. Now they make these rooms so nice and clean. Used to be we'd have buildings that had like brick walls, and you could put this right on a brick wall and you go right up the wall. Or up a tree, tree bark without branches, no problem.
Did Princess retire at your house too, Zane?
Related to the
Did Princess Rat Snake also retire to your house, or was it just Cornelius?
It was just.
Okay, because we had another snake, Princess.
So, is he related to the owl?
Owl? No, not particularly.
No.
No, these are closely related to corn snakes, which are a common pet trade snake. We have a version of the corn snake in Northwest Arkansas. They're not terribly common. It doesn't have this brilliant orange color. They're kind of gray, steely.
They'll put out a musk. I've smelled somebody's hand up at the hand of one, and it's like that sort of one.
Yeah, they will. Almost all snakes will musk as a defense. In fact, the wife of a herpetologist can usually tell exactly what he talks about. These ones have been in captivity long enough that he's not musking or anything, but certainly a wild one. Almost all the snakes have very potent musk of some sort.
Well, will they give birth underground?
Well, so these are egg layers. So the water snakes and garter snakes are live bears. They give birth just on land in a protected place somewhere. These are egg layers. Rat snakes, some of these egg layers lay underground. Most rat snakes are laying in like rotten logs or trees. In fact, they'll often have like communal nesting in a big rotten tree trunk where multiple females will come and nest like under the bark or in the rotting log.
I think he wants to hug Carter there.
Yeah. As soon as he smells a bird.
I think he'll stick with Trudy.
All right. I've got one more critter, but I'll leave that one for while I'm talking about it at the end. So that's sort of a smattering of the local species that you might see in your yard or around Northwest Arkansas. I'm going to finish up. If you could hit that light again, maybe. Oh, of course. So Copperhead I was going to talk about, since I don't have one. This is, of all of our venomous snakes, the Copperhead and secondarily Pygmy Rattlesnake are the two that you're most likely to see in sort of urbanized or residential type areas. They're very common in the forested areas of the Ozarks, much more common than I think we often realize. The way we see them the most is crossing roads at night. That's probably the best way to find a Copperhead, is to see it out crawling across the road at night. But these can be quite common. They are something that you need to be aware of in forested areas here. I would argue that they're not something you necessarily need to live in fear of. And they are an important part of our venomous snakes, certainly are an important part of our ecosystems and wildlife. In terms of what to do about venomous snakes, I will say that the good thing about Copperheads is, although they can have a medically significant bite, they're not generally considered lethal. So a Copperhead bite can be very painful and require medical attention, but you're very unlikely to die of a Copperhead bite.
Is that true for like small children?
Yeah, it's true across the board. There's very, very few records of deaths from Copperhead bites. They account for the most bites of any venomous snake in the U.S., but almost no deaths. Timber rattlesnakes, which are much less common, have much more potent venom, and a bite for a big timber rattlesnake is.
What about water moccasin bites? Are those?
They're worse than cottonmouth or than Copperhead bites, but cottonmouths actually bite much less frequently. They act very scary. But bites are much less frequent than you would expect, given how common they can be and how impressive they act.
Small children, is that a risk if they got bit by a cottonmouth?
I mean, they would absolutely need to go to the doctor for sure. Okay. Death would be in fact, death overall from snakebite in the U.S. is extremely unlikely. It's like 5 people a year, which is, I think 10 times as many people are killed by lightning strikes or by dog attacks than the snake bites.
Testament to the medical system or just to the non-lethality?
It's a little bit of both. The species that account for the most bites, like Copperheads, tend to be not particularly lethal. Also, we have very good treatment. And if you get to a hospital relatively quickly, you should be fine. We could do a whole other thing on snakebite and stuff. Bottom line is, we always say that the best snakebite kit you can have is a set of car keys. Be calm, elevate, get to the hospital in a reasonable amount of time. Don't get in a wreck on the way to the hospital. Don't try to kill the snake and bring it with you. For all of everything except for coral snakes, which don't occur in Northwest Arkansas, they're rare, but they do occur in South Central Arkansas. All of our pit vipers use the same antivenom, so it's not necessarily critical that you know what snake bit you. Take a picture, but don't. That's just a recipe for another person getting bitten.
We have a dog named Copper.
You do?
Yes.
That's cool.
Would you wear high boots or snake gaiters if you were hiking in the woods?
I almost always wear sturdy shoes or boots. Not like hiking boots. I mean, that's enough to deflect a small Copperhead or a Pygmy rattlesnake, no problem. I also just try to be careful not to step where I can't see. The only times that I wear snake boots and gaiters is going places where I know that there are very high densities of especially particularly dangerous snakes. I've worked with eastern diamondback some in the east where there are some spots where.
Speaking of pygmies, when my daughter was 4, she stepped over one and just, legs stretched out, but it did get me to thinking, because where we live, quite a few pygmies, in around the area. Is a bite from a pygmy rattler as bad as a timber?
No, it's more like a Copperhead. These,
okay.
They're sort of stories about little ones being more dangerous than big ones and not being able to meter their venom and stuff. Most of that is not particularly based in fact. Little ones can certainly give a medically significant bite. Sometimes the venom composition is different, but the small ones usually are less dangerous just because they inject less venom. They are able to meter their venom. A reasonable percentage of bites are dry bites that no venom is injected at all. My old advisor did a neat study on cottonmouths where he actually went out and found cottonmouths wearing snake boots and stuff, stepped next to the snake, then stepped on the snake, and then he had this like robotic arm that he picked the snake up with. And I think none of them bit when stepped next to. Something like 10 to 20% bit when stepped on, and more of them bit when you actually pick them up. But if you look at the snake bite statistics, the vast majority of snake bites in the U.S. are male people between 15 and 50. There's often alcohol involved. Bites are usually on the hands or fingers. So an awful lot of bites are preventable in that way. And I'll say, if you know you have venomous snakes in your yard, there's a decision to be made there. There are people who can come and remove or try to remove snakes. The best thing is to try to reduce habitat that they like, which often includes like junk and wood piles and stuff. That's also good habitat for other wildlife, so there's a balancing act there. If you have one, you have more, so removing one or two is not necessarily going to solve your problem. And again, I would argue in most cases trying to catch, unless you can easily relocate and you're comfortable doing that yourself, if you're not experienced with that, it's usually better to just let the snake go on its way.
Well, they have a wide range. Reason I ask, the last 2 summers we've had timber rattlesnakes around our house, or fairly close. Would they be traveling a wide range, or does that mean their habitat is right there, or?
They do travel quite wide ranges. So an adult timber rattlesnake could cover a couple hundred acres in its yearly routine. But if it's got a spot that it knows is a good spot, it'll come back there over and over again. If it's got a good hunting spot, it'll come back. They know their territories very well. They definitely come back to the same places over and over again. Yeah.
Would that kill a cat?
I don't know about copperheads and cats. Dogs are quite resistant to snake venom, and most dogs recover quite well from, especially copperhead bites, but even rattlesnake bites. They're much more resistant to venom than humans are. Cats, I'm not so sure about. I think cats are often pretty good at staying out of harm's way in general. They don't get bit nearly as often as dogs do. So I wanted to mention copperheads. I can't believe it because I don't have the backyard snake that everybody finds. I thought I could get one in my yard the other day, and I didn't find one.
Two.
Yeah, did you get these on Annapolis? These are the backyard urban snake in the whole South.
Yeah.
In Fayetteville, this is the DeKay's brown snake, Stereria. These are small earthworm-eating and slug-eating backyard snakes. They only get max about 1 foot long, and most of them are quite a bit smaller. They're related to garter snakes and water snakes. And these, for some reason, they're found in the woods too, but in the woods, you never find these like you do ringneck snakes. We might find 1 or 2 in an afternoon, but we're never going to find like ringnecks. You'll find like 10 under one rock sometimes.
Yeah, baby chickens.
In urban areas, these things take off, and these are like the urban snake. We do get ringneck snakes and stuff too, but you can find these, in the most urbanized habitats. They love like paving stones and stuff like that. Completely harmless. They're often, when people have a nest of copperheads in their yard, it's often these. A lot of the landscapers don't really understand that these are not copperheads. Obviously, the pattern is very different. These have a very distinctive Hershey kiss shaped pattern. The pattern's weak, and it's usually kind of dots or at most some lines down their back. But look for these in your yard. If you haven't seen one yet, you probably have these in your yard. They're great. They eat slugs and stuff and snails and earthworms, so they're good to have in your garden. Really neat little snakes. They tend to be particularly evident this time of year, and this time of year I'm just getting emails every single day with nests of copperheads. I should mention baby copperheads. So they do have this distinctive pattern. Also, a young copperhead has a bright yellow tail tip. They use this in a really cool behavior called caudal luring, where they coil up in a coil like that, and they wiggle that thing to look like a little caterpillar or worm, and that attracts things like frogs and lizards that they can then bite. But that's another good way to identify a baby copperhead. And copperheads are born quite a bit bigger than a lot of our other snakes. They're born about this big, so you never find a teeny tiny copperhead.
We have a dog named Copper,
Cool.
and he's super snuggly.
Okay, so a few things you can do to make your yard herp-friendly. So how can you sort of invite these animals to come live with you? Well, as with all wildlife, we're thinking about things like food, water, and shelter. I'll add to that for these ectotherms, the thermal environment. So how, where the warm and cool areas are is also really important. This is one reason why encroachment of really aggressive invasive vegetation can be so bad for these species. So things like bush honeysuckle and privet, if those form a thick understory and don't allow light down, most of the reptiles are not going to be able to get as warm as they want to be, and they disappear pretty quickly from those places. In terms of food, most of the species I'm talking about are eating insects or small mammals or perhaps birds. And in that line, usually the mantra we use is that, biodiversity encourages biodiversity. So native vegetation encourages large diversity and abundances of native insects, native small mammals, native birds, and those are in turn going to serve as prey for some of our reptiles and amphibians. So from a food perspective, sort of starting at the base of the food chain is the best way to encourage these animals to be here. I always love this little thing where, if nothing's eating your plants, then your garden's not part of the ecosystem. So, when we see insects in our gardens, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but those are not pests, they're part of the food chain, right? Water is very important, so especially for amphibians. Most amphibians need some moisture, so need some area of the environment that's moist. And if you really want to encourage amphibians, water features are the way to go. So natural environments, as I mentioned, where these amphibians are breeding, are things like these vernal pools. This is a prairie type wetland, even ditches or roadside ditches or places like that. You go to these kind of places in the spring. At the right time, you can see just massive aggregations of these animals. So these are some spotted salamanders. We just dip into these in a few minutes at a breeding pond. This is actually a pond up on Mount Kessler where I take students in the spring. Every one of these little white dots is a spring peeper. So, there's literally hundreds of spring peepers just in this one photo. And keep in mind, these are just the males. These are the males that are singing. There's just as many females out there hanging out in the water, not sitting on their little perches. And every one of those females is laying a couple hundred eggs apiece. So think about how many tadpoles that is. So water features like garden ponds and rain gardens are great for encouraging amphibians. The most important thing to remember is that fish are bad. Even fish like little mosquito fish and goldfish, some amphibians can live alongside those okay, but no fish is by far the best way to go for amphibians. And certainly things like sunfish or bass will eat up almost every amphibian. The bullfrogs are about the only one that do very well, or sometimes newts, with fish in a wetland. Hydro period is also really important. So especially when you're considering like a rain garden, a lot of rain gardens are built so that the water drains out fairly quickly. It stays moist, but it doesn't hold water. If you really want amphibians, you want something that holds a pool of water for at least a month. And ideally more like 2 to 3 months, March or February to May or June, perhaps early July. And if you do that, it's amazing. You build these things and they will come, right? They come from the landscape. They find these areas. Again, I'm just a block off Dixon. My neighbor has a little pond like this, and she has like 5 or 6 species of amphibians that breed in that pond successfully.
So what about mosquitoes? It sounds like everything you describe is the perfect environment for mosquitoes.
Yeah, it can be. I would say, the best would be if it dries up by mid-June or so, at which point that's when the mosquitoes really tend to get bad. And if it dries up at that point, they're not going to be as much of a problem. If you can get salamanders in there, the salamander larvae are little carnivores, and they'll gobble up those guys quickly, but salamanders aren't often as quick to colonize. Yeah?
Is there any known negative reaction? I know Doug Calamy recommends what I take to be sort of like a spermicide tab, those dunks or donuts that you put in water for mosquitoes. I didn't know if that would have a negative impact. It says it's safe for, he claims it's safe for animals to drink out of and all this stuff. So
I don't know about those specifically. I know certainly some of the pesticides they use for mosquitoes are not good. I don't know about those dunks specifically.
Which is the Bacillus thuringiensis, and I don't know if that's harmful to salamanders and all that.
I don't think it is, but I think those are like caterpillar specific. Anyway.
Just a time check, we are a little over, so the lady came by and let us know that we do have to wrap up.
Okay. Shelter. Leaf piles and brush piles are great. Don't rake your leaves completely. Leave a patch of leaves. It's great for things to hide in. Leaving rock in your garden, so habitats like this with rock and open sun are great for reptiles. So leave your rock walls jumbled. Don't put concrete in between them. Those are great spots for places for things to hide. Specifically about box turtles, so box turtles are one I didn't get to talk about much, but they're at least omnivorous, so they eat both fruits and vegetables and insects. Planting native fruits like persimmon, blackberry, pawpaw. Box turtles love those.
All strawberries.
They love, wild strawberries, mushrooms. Shelter like brush piles and leaf litter is great for them. If you see a box turtle crossing the road, by all means, move it out of the way. Move it the way it was going so it gets where it's trying to go. Don't move them very far because they know exactly where they're going. Most of the studies say if you move them very far, they just try to come back and they usually get themselves in trouble. And, it's fine for a kid to hold on to a turtle for a few days, a couple of weeks even, feed them some worms and strawberries, put them back where they're from. These are long-lived animals. They can live to be 100 years old, and they need that long lifespan to persist in nature. Also, I've heard some mention of iNaturalist and things like that. By all means, contribute to our knowledge through those kinds of citizen science programs. Educate people. Talk to your neighbor who wants to kill every snake. And I usually found that a little reasoned conversation without too much judgment goes a long way. And support local conservation efforts. There's some great guidelines. If you look this up online, these are available free online. I think that give some much more broad scale management guidelines for herpetologist.
It's a frog.
And I probably don't have time for questions, but it's been great talking to you guys. You guys had great questions along the way.
Herpetologist.com is a wonderful.
Yes, wonderful resource. Yeah.